The coffee mug slipped from my trembling hands, shattering against the kitchen floor of my childhood home as my mother's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Really, Sarah? More dramatics? You've been home for 3 days and all you've done is cry and complain. Other women manage just fine with newborns." I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Standing in the doorway with my 6-week-old daughter Emma cradled against my chest, I felt the familiar wave of exhaustion and despair wash over me. What my family didn't know, as they dismissed my struggles as attention-seeking behavior, was that my husband David, who they had met only briefly at our small wedding ceremony 8 months earlier, was Dr. David Chen, one of Chicago's most respected perinatal psychiatrists. In exactly 4 days, he would be arriving from his medical conference in Boston to collect Emma and me, and when he witnessed their treatment firsthand, everything would change. The morning of October 3rd had begun like every day since I'd reluctantly agreed to stay with my family while David attended his week-long psychiatric symposium. Emma's cries had woken me at 4:30 a.m., and despite my exhaustion, I'd tried to nurse her quietly to avoid disturbing anyone in my parents' sprawling suburban home in Naperville, Illinois. But the feeding hadn't gone well. Nothing seemed to go well anymore, and Emma had continued crying despite my increasingly desperate attempts to soothe her. My mother, Patricia Morrison, had appeared in the guest room doorway, wearing her perfectly pressed robe and an expression of thinly veiled irritation. At 52, she embodied everything that small-town success was supposed to look like: immaculate appearance, active in community organizations, and absolutely convinced that life's problems could be solved through proper planning and sufficient willpower. Her auburn hair was already styled despite the early hour, and her makeup applied with the precision of someone who had never appeared less than perfect in public. "Sarah, honey, you're going to spoil that baby if you pick her up every time she makes a sound," she had said, settling into the antique rocking chair that had belonged to my grandmother. "When I had you and your sister, we let babies cry it out. It builds character and teaches them independence." Quote. I had wanted to explain that Emma was only 6 weeks old, that the pediatrician had specifically advised against sleep training at such a young age, that my instincts told me something was wrong when she cried like this. Instead, I found myself apologizing. "I'm sorry, Mom, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. She just won't settle." "Well, for starters, you're too anxious. Babies can sense that energy. You need to project confidence and authority." Patricia had reached for Emma, her movements efficient and practiced. "See?" She just needed someone calm to hold her. Emma had indeed quieted in my mother's arms, which only reinforced my growing belief that I was fundamentally failing as a mother. What I didn't understand then was that newborns often respond to novelty, and that my mother's confidence came from 40 years of distance from the reality of caring for an infant around the clock. But in that moment, watching my daughter settle against someone else's chest, I felt the crushing weight of inadequacy that had become my constant companion. My father, Robert Morrison, had emerged from the master bedroom shortly after, adjusting his tie with the methodical precision of someone whose life ran on carefully maintained schedules. At 55, he was the successful owner of Morrison Insurance Services, a business he had built through decades of early mornings and late nights. His approach to problems was systematic and results-oriented. Identify the issue, implement a solution, measure the outcome. The concept of struggle without clear resolution was foreign to his worldview. "Everything all right down here?" he had asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and found it wanting. "Sarah, you look exhausted. Are you getting enough sleep?" "She's been up with the baby," my mother had answered for me. "I keep telling her she needs to establish a routine, but she won't listen." Robert nodded approvingly. "Your mother managed 2 babies and kept the house running smoothly. It's about time management and priorities." He had poured himself coffee from the pot my mother had prepared, his movements economical and purposeful. "Maybe you should consider letting Emma cry a bit more. Builds resilience." My sister Jessica had joined us then, her nursing scrubs crisp and professional, despite the early hour. At 29, she was 2 years older than me and never let me forget it. She worked as a charge nurse at the local hospital's pediatric unit, a position that gave her absolute confidence in all matters related to children and healthcare. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail, and her expression carried the perpetual slight impatience of someone who dealt with medical emergencies and found civilian problems trivial by comparison. "Sarah, you're making this harder than it needs to be," Jessica had said, accepting a cup of coffee from our father. "I see new moms all the time who think every little thing is a crisis. Emma looks perfectly healthy to me. You just need to relax and trust your instincts." "But what if my instincts are wrong?" I whispered, taking Emma back from my mother's arms. "What if I'm not cut out for this?" "That's just baby blues talking," Jessica had replied dismissively. "Every new mom goes through a phase of feeling overwhelmed. It passes. You just need to push through it instead of wallowing." The conversation had continued in variations throughout the morning, each family member offering their version of helpful advice that somehow made me feel smaller and more incompetent. They spoke about my struggles with the casual authority of people who had never experienced what I was going through, or who had forgotten the reality through the softening lens of time. What none of them knew was that my husband David understood exactly what I was experiencing. Dr. David Chen had spent the last 8 years specializing in perinatal and postpartum mental health at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. His research on postpartum depression had been published in major psychiatric journals, and he regularly consulted with other medical professionals about the complex interplay of hormones, sleep deprivation, and psychological adjustment that characterizes the postpartum period. David and I had met 2 years earlier when I was working as a research coordinator at the University of Chicago Medical Center. I had been managing clinical trials for various psychiatric studies, including several related to maternal mental health. Our professional relationship had evolved into friendship, then romance, then marriage, with a speed that had surprised both of us. Our wedding had been small and intimate, held in Chicago with only immediate family present. My parents had attended, of course, but they had spent most of the weekend focused on the logistics of travel and accommodations rather than getting to know David beyond basic pleasantries. David's quiet, thoughtful demeanor could be mistaken for shyness by people who didn't know him well. He listened more than he spoke, asked careful questions, and considered his responses before offering them. At family gatherings, he had seemed content to observe rather than dominate conversations, which my family had interpreted as either lack of opinion or lack of confidence. They had no idea that his restraint came from professional training and personal wisdom, rather than social discomfort. When I had called David from my parents' house 3 days earlier, crying and barely coherent, he had listened with the patience of someone who understood that postpartum emotional volatility was a medical reality rather than a character flaw. "Sarah, you're dealing with a perfect storm of hormonal changes, sleep deprivation, and major life adjustment," he had said gently. "What you're experiencing is real, and it's not your fault." "But they keep saying other women handle this better," I had sobbed into the phone. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just weak." "Sarah, listen to me carefully. You are not weak. You are dealing with a recognized medical condition that affects up to 20% of new mothers. The fact that your family doesn't understand this doesn't make your experience less valid or less real." David had wanted to cut his conference short and drive to Illinois immediately, but I had convinced him to stay. The symposium was important for his career, and I felt guilty enough about my struggles without derailing his professional obligations. We had compromised on daily phone calls and his promise to arrive as scheduled on Sunday to drive Emma and me back to Chicago. What I hadn't told him was how systematically my family was undermining my confidence and dismissing my concerns. I hadn't described the way they spoke about my struggles as if they were character flaws rather than symptoms, or how their constant suggestions implied that I was simply not trying hard enough to be a good mother. The truth was, I had been struggling since Emma's birth 6 weeks earlier. The pregnancy had been healthy and uncomplicated, and I had expected the transition to motherhood to be challenging but manageable. Instead, I found myself overwhelmed by emotions I couldn't control, and doubts that consumed my thoughts. The joy I had expected to feel was buried under layers of anxiety, exhaustion, and a persistent sense that I was failing at the most fundamental human task. David had recognized the signs immediately. He had gently suggested that I might be experiencing postpartum depression and had recommended a therapist who specialized in maternal mental health. But when I had mentioned this possibility to my family during a phone call, their response had been swift and dismissive. "Oh, Sarah, you don't need therapy," my mother had said. "You just need to adjust your expectations and focus on being grateful for your healthy baby." "Everyone feels overwhelmed with their first child," Jessica had added. "Therapy is for people with serious problems, not normal new mom adjustments." Their certainty had made me question David's assessment and my own experiences. If my family, who loved me and wanted the best for me, thought I was overreacting, maybe I was. Maybe I just needed to try harder, sleep more, complain less. But trying harder hasn't helped. Sleep remained elusive no matter how exhausted I felt, and the crying spells came without warning or apparent cause. I loved Emma desperately, but I felt like I was failing her every day. The simplest tasks felt overwhelming, and I found myself crying over things that shouldn't have mattered. A failed attempt at breastfeeding, a onesie that didn't fit properly, the way Emma seemed to prefer other people's arms to mine. My family's stay-at-home solution was meant to provide support, but it had become another source of stress. Every interaction reinforced my sense of inadequacy. When Emma cried, someone always had a suggestion about what I was doing wrong. When I struggled with breastfeeding, someone reminded me that formula was expensive and breast milk was better. When I felt overwhelmed by the constant demands of infant care, someone shared a story about how much easier it had been when they were young parents. The house itself felt like a museum of successful family life, with framed photos documenting decades of achievements and celebrations. My parents had raised 2 daughters who had excelled in school, participated in appropriate activities, and made them proud. Jessica had become a successful nurse, married a reliable man, and seemed to handle every challenge with competence and grace. I had always been the more sensitive one, the daughter who needed more encouragement and reassurance, but I had still managed to complete college, build a career, and marry a wonderful man. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Now, surrounded by evidence of my family's capacity for success and happiness, I felt like a fundamental failure. If other women in my family had managed motherhood without falling apart, what was wrong with me? If my struggles were really medical rather than personal, why did I feel so ashamed of them? The guest room where Emma and I were staying had been decorated with care, featuring a beautiful crib that my parents had purchased and soft yellow walls that were supposed to be soothing. But it felt like a temporary space, somewhere I was visiting rather than belonging. My childhood bedroom had been converted to my father's home office years earlier, and while my parents had made accommodations for my visit, the house clearly functioned around their established routines and preferences. Emma seemed to sense my anxiety and uncertainty. She had been an easy baby during our first weeks at home in Chicago, but since arriving at my parents' house, she had been fussier and more difficult to soothe. Whether this was due to the change in environment, my increased stress levels, or simply normal infant development, I couldn't tell. But every difficult moment felt like confirmation that I was doing something wrong. The worst part was the loneliness. Surrounded by family who wanted to help, I felt more isolated than I had when I was alone with Emma in our Chicago apartment. Their help came with constant feedback and suggestions that implied I wasn't capable of making good decisions about my own child. Their love felt conditional on my ability to demonstrate competence and gratitude that I simply couldn't muster. David's absence felt more acute in this environment. At home, he had been my partner in figuring out parenthood, equally uncertain but willing to learn alongside me. He had never made me feel stupid for asking questions or inadequate for struggling. His professional knowledge had been a resource rather than a judgment, and his emotional support had been unconditional. Here, every conversation felt like a performance where I was failing to hit the right notes. I was supposed to be grateful for my healthy baby, competent in my new role, and gracious about the help being offered. Instead, I felt overwhelmed, confused, and increasingly convinced that everyone would be better off without me. The irony was that in 4 days, when David arrived to collect us, my family would finally meet the man I had married. They would discover that their dismissal of my concerns contradicted the professional opinion of someone with extensive expertise in exactly the issues I was facing. They would learn that their casual suggestions about toughening up and trying harder were not only unhelpful, but potentially harmful to someone experiencing a recognized medical condition. But in that moment, standing in the kitchen with broken ceramic at my feet and Emma crying against my chest, I had no idea that vindication was coming. I only knew that I was failing at something that should have come naturally, disappointing people who wanted me to succeed, and drowning in emotions I couldn't control or explain. The day stretched ahead with the promise of more well-meaning advice, more subtle criticisms, and more evidence that I wasn't measuring up to the standards of motherhood that seemed so achievable for everyone else. I had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, or that the man who truly understood what I was going through was already planning how to educate the people who claimed to love me about the reality of what I was experiencing. The rain pelted against the windows of the University of Chicago Medical Center as I organized research files in my cramped office, completely unaware that the quiet man reviewing patient charts at the desk across from mine would become the most important person in my life. It was March 15th, 2 years before Emma's birth, and I was drowning in paperwork for 3 simultaneous clinical trials studying various aspects of psychiatric treatment efficacy. Dr. David Chen had been assigned to our research unit 6 months earlier as the principal investigator for a groundbreaking study on perinatal mental health interventions. Unlike the other physicians who rotated through our department with grand pronouncements and inflated egos, David worked with methodical precision and spoke only when he had something meaningful to contribute. His colleagues respected him, patients trusted him, and the nursing staff actually smiled when they saw his name on the schedule. I had been working as a research coordinator for 2 years, since completing my master's degree in clinical psychology from Northwestern. The position was supposed to be temporary, a stepping stone while I decided whether to pursue doctoral studies or transition into private practice. Instead, I had discovered a passion for the intersection of academic research and real-world patient care that kept me engaged despite the demanding hours and modest salary. My office walls were covered with flowcharts tracking patient enrollment, treatment protocols, and outcome measurements for studies investigating everything from anxiety disorders to bipolar medication efficacy. The work required meticulous attention to detail, excellent organizational skills, and the ability to communicate complex medical concepts to research participants who were often struggling with serious mental health challenges. David's study was different from the others I managed. While most psychiatric research focused on established conditions with well-defined treatment protocols, his work examined the gray areas where normal life transitions intersected with clinical mental health concerns. He was particularly interested in how hormonal changes, sleep disruption, and social support systems affected women's psychological well-being during pregnancy and the postpartum period. "Sarah, do you have a moment to review these screening criteria?" David had asked one afternoon, approaching my desk with a thick folder of documentation. His voice carried a slight accent that I later learned reflected his childhood in both California and Taiwan, where his parents had maintained family connections. The screening criteria were more nuanced than typical psychiatric research protocols. Instead of simply identifying women with diagnosed depression or anxiety, David's study sought to understand the spectrum of emotional experiences that new mothers navigated, from brief adjustment difficulties to serious clinical conditions requiring medical intervention. These parameters seem unusually broad, I had observed, reviewing the detailed questionnaires and assessment tools. Most studies want clear diagnostic categories. "That's exactly the problem," David had replied, settling into the chair beside my desk. "We're missing crucial information about women who don't meet traditional diagnostic criteria but are still struggling significantly. The medical community has created artificial boundaries that don't reflect the reality of maternal mental health." Quote, "Our conversation had extended well beyond the research protocols into broader discussions about healthcare systems, social support structures, and the ways that medical training sometimes failed to address the full spectrum of human experience." David's perspective was informed by years of clinical practice, but also by personal observations about how cultural expectations and family dynamics influenced women's willingness to seek help or acknowledge their struggles. His own family background had shaped his understanding of mental health stigma and cultural barriers to treatment. His parents had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1970s, establishing successful careers in engineering and accounting, while maintaining traditional values about family roles and emotional expression. David had grown up navigating between cultures, understanding both the strength that came from family loyalty and the limitations that resulted from rigid expectations about success and emotional resilience. In my family, admitting struggle was seen as character weakness rather than human reality, David had explained during one of our early conversations. My mother experienced what I now recognize as significant postpartum depression after my sister's birth, but there was no framework for understanding or addressing it. She was expected to be grateful for her healthy child and manage her responsibilities without complaint. David's path to psychiatry had been unconventional. His undergraduate degree was in biochemistry, and he had initially planned to pursue research in neuropharmacology. However, during medical school rotations, he had discovered that his real interest lay in the complex interactions between biological processes and psychological experiences. His residency in psychiatry had been followed by specialized fellowship training in reproductive psychiatry, a field that was just beginning to gain recognition within the broader medical community. His approach to patient care reflected both scientific rigor and genuine empathy for the women who sought his help. He understood that postpartum mental health challenges existed on a continuum, from normal adjustment difficulties to severe conditions requiring intensive intervention. More importantly, he recognized that family support and social understanding played crucial roles in recovery outcomes. The research study that had brought us together was designed to identify early intervention strategies that could prevent minor postpartum adjustment issues from developing into more serious clinical conditions. David hypothesized that many women received inadequate support during the critical postpartum period because their families and healthcare providers failed to recognize the signs of emerging mental health challenges. "We're trying to catch women before they fall through the cracks," he had explained. "Too often, we wait until someone is in crisis before offering help. By then, the recovery process is much more complicated, and the impact on family relationships is more severe." My role in the study involved conducting initial screenings with potential participants, coordinating follow-up assessments, and maintaining detailed records of each woman's progress through the research protocol. The work required building trust with research participants, who were often vulnerable and uncertain about their experiences. The women who enrolled in David's study came from diverse backgrounds, but they shared common themes in their stories. Many described feeling isolated despite being surrounded by family members who wanted to help. They reported receiving advice that minimized their concerns or suggested that their struggles indicated personal inadequacy rather than normal adjustment challenges. Lisa, a 34-year-old attorney, had explained during her screening interview, "Everyone keeps telling me I should be grateful because my baby is healthy and my husband is supportive. But I feel like I'm drowning, and when I try to explain that, people act like I'm being dramatic or ungrateful." Margaret, a 28-year-old teacher, had described similar experiences. "My mother-in-law keeps reminding me that she raised 4 children without all this fuss about mental health. She makes me feel like asking for help is a sign of weakness rather than wisdom." These stories had resonated with my own observations about family dynamics and mental health stigma. My master's degree research had focused on barriers to mental health treatment among young adults, and I had identified family attitudes as one of the most significant factors influencing whether people sought appropriate care. Working with David had expanded my understanding of how these dynamics played out, specifically in the context of maternal mental health. The cultural expectation that motherhood should be naturally fulfilling created additional pressure for women who were struggling with the reality of caring for infants, while managing their own physical and emotional recovery. David's research was groundbreaking because it acknowledged these pressures while providing evidence-based interventions that could be implemented within existing healthcare systems. His preliminary findings suggested that early identification and support could significantly improve outcomes for women experiencing postpartum adjustment challenges. Our professional collaboration had gradually evolved into personal friendship as we discovered shared interests beyond medical research. David was an accomplished pianist who found stress relief in classical music composition. His small Chicago apartment contained a beautiful baby grand piano that had belonged to his grandmother, and he would spend evening hours working through complex pieces that required complete concentration and precision. I had been a literature major before switching to psychology, and I maintained passionate interests in contemporary fiction and poetry. My weekends often involved browsing independent bookstores and attending readings at local literary venues. David had initially seemed surprised by my enthusiasm for creative writing, but he had proven to be a thoughtful discussion partner about books and ideas. Our first non-work conversation had occurred during a particularly stressful week, when 3 different studies were experiencing recruitment challenges and budget constraints. I had been working late, trying to resolve scheduling conflicts and participant concerns, when David had noticed my frustration and offered to help. "You look like you could use a break," he had said, glancing at the stacks of paperwork covering my desk. "There's a good Vietnamese restaurant nearby if you're interested in dinner that doesn't come from the hospital cafeteria." The restaurant had been tiny and unpretentious, the kind of place that served authentic food to people who cared more about flavor than atmosphere. Our conversation ranged from research methodologies, to family backgrounds, to personal goals and concerns. I had learned about David's complicated relationship with his parents' expectations, and his decision to specialize in a field that was not well understood within his cultural community. David had seemed genuinely interested in my perspectives about research ethics and patient advocacy. Unlike many physicians who viewed research coordinators as administrative support, he recognized that my daily interactions with study participants provided valuable insights about patient experiences and treatment effectiveness. "You understand things about our research participants that I missed during clinical assessments," he had told me. "Your observations about family dynamics and social support systems are just as important as the quantitative data we're collecting." That dinner had led to others, and gradually to weekend activities that had nothing to do with medical research. David had introduced me to chamber music concerts and art museums that I had never thought to visit. I had shared my enthusiasm for independent films and literary events that expanded his understanding of Chicago's cultural offerings. The transition from friendship to romance had been gradual and natural rather than dramatic or complicated. We had both been cautious about workplace relationships and mindful of the professional boundaries that were important to maintain within our research environment. However, our personal compatibility had become increasingly obvious to both of us and to colleagues who observed our interactions. David's proposal had been characteristic of his thoughtful approach to important decisions. Instead of a grand romantic gesture, he had chosen a quiet moment during a weekend walk through Lincoln Park to explain why he wanted to build a life together. His reasoning had been both practical and emotional, acknowledging the challenges of medical careers while expressing confidence in our ability to support each other's professional and personal goals. Our wedding had been small and intimate, held at the Chicago Botanic Garden with only immediate family members present. David's parents had traveled from California, bringing with them traditional elements that honored his cultural heritage while accepting his choice to marry outside their community. My parents had been polite but somewhat reserved, uncertain about David's quiet demeanor and different cultural background. The reception had been elegant but understated, reflecting our preference for meaningful celebration over elaborate display. David's colleagues from the medical center had mixed easily with my friends from graduate school and previous jobs. The conversation had been stimulating, the food excellent, and the overall atmosphere warm and welcoming. However, I had noticed that my family seemed somewhat overwhelmed by David's professional accomplishments and the respect he commanded among his colleagues. They had expected to offer guidance and support to their younger daughter's new husband, but instead found themselves in the presence of someone whose expertise and reputation exceeded their ability to provide mentorship. My mother had later commented that David seemed very serious and perhaps a bit intense for someone so young. My father had wondered aloud whether psychiatrists might be too analytical for comfortable family relationships. Jessica had suggested that David's quiet confidence might indicate arrogance or social discomfort. These observations had puzzled me because they contradicted my own experience of David as warm, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in other people's perspectives. I had attributed their concerns to the natural adjustment period that occurs when families expand to include new members with different backgrounds and communication styles. David's integration into my family had been complicated by the fact that his work schedule made family gatherings difficult to attend regularly. Hospital emergencies and patient crises didn't respect holiday schedules or planned celebrations. When he did participate in family events, his tendency to listen more than he spoke had been interpreted as lack of engagement rather than respectful attention. The truth was that David possessed deep knowledge about family dynamics and interpersonal relationships that informed his professional practice, but also made him cautious about offering unsolicited opinions or advice. He understood that families developed complex systems of communication and support that could be disrupted by outside perspectives, even well-intentioned ones. His specialty in perinatal psychiatry had developed from recognition that maternal mental health challenges occurred within family systems that could either support or undermine recovery. His research consistently demonstrated that family understanding and support were crucial factors in treatment outcomes, but that many families lacked accurate information about postpartum mental health conditions. When I had become pregnant with Emma, David's professional knowledge had provided reassurance about normal pregnancy experiences, while also preparing us for potential challenges that might arise during the postpartum period. He had explained the hormonal changes that would affect my emotional regulation, the sleep disruption that would impact my cognitive functioning, and the psychological adjustments that would be required as we transitioned to parenthood. More importantly, he had helped me understand that postpartum mental health challenges were medical conditions rather than personal failures, and that seeking appropriate treatment was a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. His expertise would prove invaluable in the coming weeks, though neither of us could have predicted how dramatically our family would need that knowledge. The grandfather clock in my parents' hallway chimed 7 times as I attempted to eat breakfast while bouncing Emma on my knee, her fussiness making even the simplest tasks feel overwhelming. Jessica sat across from me at the dining room table, efficiently consuming her Greek yogurt and granola while scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up to offer commentary on my parenting techniques. "You're creating bad habits by holding her during meals," Jessica observed, not looking up from her screen. "Babies need to learn independence early, or they become clingy and demanding. In our pediatric unit, we see the results of permissive parenting all the time, children who can't self-soothe because their mothers never taught them proper boundaries." I shifted Emma to my other arm, trying to take a bite of toast that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. "She's only 6 weeks old, Jess. I don't think she's capable of manipulation yet." "You'd be surprised how early behavioral patterns develop," Jessica replied, with the authority of someone who had witnessed countless medical situations, but never experienced motherhood herself. "The nurses and I were just discussing yesterday how some babies are naturally easy while others seem determined to make life difficult for their parents. It's all about establishing who's in control from the beginning." My mother entered the dining room carrying a steaming cup of coffee and the morning newspaper, her movements crisp and purposeful despite the early hour. She had already completed her morning routine of shower, makeup, and coordinated outfit selection, looking like she was prepared for a business meeting rather than a quiet day at home. "Sarah, dear, I've been thinking about your sleeping schedule," Patricia announced, settling into her chair at the head of the table. "I believe part of your problem is that you're too responsive to Emma's nighttime fussiness. When Jessica and you were babies, I learned to distinguish between genuine need and simple testing behavior. Once I stopped rushing to your cribs at every sound, you both became much better sleepers." "But Emma is breastfeeding," I protested weakly. "The pediatrician said I should nurse on demand during the first few months to establish supply and support her growth." "Pediatricians today are far too indulgent," my mother replied dismissively. "In my generation, we understood that babies needed structure and discipline from birth. I had you on a 4-hour feeding schedule by the time you were 3 weeks old, and you thrived. This modern approach of catering to every infant whim creates unnecessary stress for everyone involved." Jessica nodded approvingly while continuing to scroll through what appeared to be work-related emails. "Mom's right. We see babies in the hospital who are completely dysregulated because their parents never established consistent routines. The ones who do best are the ones whose mothers maintained authority and didn't give in to every cry or fuss." I wanted to explain that Emma's pediatrician had specifically warned against rigid feeding schedules for breastfed babies, that newborn sleep patterns were naturally irregular and would gradually organize over time, that responsive parenting was associated with better emotional regulation in later childhood. Instead, I found myself nodding and apologizing for my apparent lack of discipline and structure. The truth was that Emma's behavior had been relatively predictable during our first weeks at home in Chicago. She had her fussy periods and difficult nights, but David and I had developed strategies for managing her needs while supporting each other through the challenging aspects of new parenthood. Since arriving at my parents' house, however, everything felt more chaotic and unpredictable. Whether this change was due to the unfamiliar environment, my increased anxiety levels, or simply normal infant development, I couldn't determine. But every difficult moment felt like confirmation of my family's assessment that I was handling motherhood poorly. When Emma cried during family conversations, I felt embarrassed and defensive. When she refused to settle for other people, I worried that my anxiety was somehow contaminating her emotional state. My father appeared in the doorway, adjusting his tie with the precision of someone whose daily routine rarely varied. Robert's morning schedule included coffee, newspaper headlines, and brief family interaction before departing for the office, where problems could be solved through systematic analysis and decisive action. "How was the night?" he asked, though his tone suggested he had already heard the answer and found it concerning. We could hear Emma crying around 3 o'clock, and again around 5:30. "She's been having some trouble settling," I admitted, feeling the familiar heat of shame and inadequacy creeping up my neck. "I've been trying different strategies, but nothing seems to work consistently." "Maybe it's time to consider letting her cry it out," Robert suggested, pouring himself coffee from the pot my mother had prepared earlier. "Sometimes babies need to learn that nighttime is for sleeping, not for entertaining themselves with parental attention. It might be difficult for a few nights, but the long-term benefits are worth the temporary discomfort." "She's too young for sleep training," I said quietly, but my protest lacked conviction. If my family, who had successfully raised children and witnessed countless other parents navigate these challenges, believed that firmer boundaries were necessary, maybe I was being too permissive. "Nonsense," my mother interjected. "Babies are more adaptable than modern parenting experts give them credit for. The problem is that today's mothers are afraid to let their children experience any discomfort, which creates dependent, anxious children who never learn resilience." Jessica looked up from her phone to add her professional perspective. "We see the effects of over-responsive parenting in our pediatric patients all the time. Children who have meltdowns over minor medical procedures because they've never learned to cope with temporary discomfort. Parents who can't leave their children with babysitters because the kids have never learned to trust anyone else for care." Quote. The conversation continued in variations throughout the morning, with each family member contributing their expertise about infant care, sleep training, and proper parenting boundaries. Their advice was offered with genuine concern for Emma's well-being and my adjustment to motherhood, but it consistently implied that my instincts and responses were inadequate or misguided. The pattern extended beyond feeding and sleeping issues to encompass every aspect of infant care. When I expressed concern about Emma's fussiness during tummy time, Jessica explained that babies needed to build tolerance for temporary discomfort. When I worried about her crying during diaper changes, my mother suggested that I was being too gentle and needed to work more efficiently. When I struggled with breastfeeding positions that were comfortable for both Emma and me, my father recommended switching to formula feeding to eliminate variables and uncertainty. Each suggestion was reasonable in isolation, but collectively they created a narrative in which my maternal instincts were unreliable and my emotional responses were counterproductive. The underlying message was that successful parenting required suppressing natural responsiveness in favor of systematic approaches that prioritized long-term behavioral outcomes over immediate comfort and connection. This philosophy extended to their assessment of my own emotional state and adjustment to motherhood. When I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by the constant demands of infant care, they reminded me that all new mothers experienced temporary adjustment challenges. When I described difficulties sleeping even when Emma was resting peacefully, they suggested that I was creating problems through excessive worry and analysis. "You're overthinking everything," Jessica observed during one particularly difficult morning when Emma had been fussy despite my attempts to address possible causes. "Babies cry. It's what they do. You can't solve every problem or prevent every moment of discomfort. Sometimes you just have to accept that parenting involves dealing with unpleasant situations." "But how do I know when crying is normal and when it indicates a problem?" I asked, genuinely seeking guidance about infant communication and care. "Experience," my mother replied confidently. "After a few weeks, you develop intuition about your baby's needs and patterns. The problem is that you're second-guessing yourself constantly instead of trusting your instincts and making confident decisions. The irony was that my instincts were telling me that something was wrong, not necessarily with Emma, but with my ability to cope with the normal demands of motherhood. I felt emotionally fragile in ways that seemed disproportionate to the challenges I was facing. Simple tasks felt overwhelming, and I found myself crying over minor frustrations that should have been manageable. When I had attempted to explain these feelings to my family, their response was consistently dismissive rather than exploratory. They interpreted my emotional volatility as evidence of immaturity or self-indulgence, rather than as potential symptoms of a medical condition that might benefit from professional assessment and support. Everyone feels overwhelmed with their first baby, my mother had said when I tried to describe the intensity of my emotional responses. The difference is that most women push through those feelings instead of dwelling on them. You're too focused on analyzing your emotional state instead of just doing what needs to be done. New mothers always feel like they're failing, Jessica had added. It's a normal part of the adjustment process. The ones who do well are the ones who don't indulge those feelings or seek validation for every doubt and concern. Their certainty about normal postpartum experiences was absolute, despite the fact that none of them had specialized training in maternal mental health or current knowledge about postpartum psychological conditions. They spoke with the authority of personal experience, which felt more compelling than abstract medical information about conditions they had never witnessed or acknowledged. The daily rhythm of life in my parents' house reinforced these dynamics through countless small interactions and observations. During breakfast, my family would discuss their day's plans and responsibilities with efficiency and confidence, while I struggled to coordinate basic infant care with simple personal needs like eating and hygiene. Their competence in managing their established routines highlighted my apparent inability to establish any routine with Emma. During afternoon visits from family, friends, and neighbors who stopped by to meet Emma, I would listen to stories about other new mothers who seemed to be managing their transitions to parenthood with grace and competence. These women were described as naturally nurturing, instinctively confident, and appropriately grateful for their healthy babies and supportive families. Linda's daughter just had her second baby, and she's handling everything beautifully, my mother would report after coffee with her church friends. She's already back to her pre-pregnancy weight, and the baby is sleeping through the night. She says the key is maintaining perspective and not making mountains out of molehills. My coworker brought her new baby to visit last week, and you'd never know she had given birth 6 weeks ago, Jessica would add. She looks amazing, the baby was perfectly content, and she was already making plans to return to work. Some women just have that natural maternal confidence. These comparisons were never explicitly directed at me, but their implication was unmistakable. Other women were managing the same challenges I faced with apparent ease and satisfaction. If I was struggling with tasks they found straightforward, the problem was with my approach or attitude, rather than with the demands themselves. The most painful aspect of these daily interactions was the growing disconnect between my internal experience and my family's assessment of my situation. They saw a new mother who was being unnecessarily dramatic about normal adjustment challenges. I felt like I was drowning in emotions and responsibilities that I couldn't manage despite my best efforts. When Emma would have a particularly difficult day with extended crying periods and resistance to soothing efforts, my family would observe my stress and frustration with expressions of concern mixed with subtle criticism. Their body language and tone suggested that a more competent mother would have handled the situation more effectively. When I would have moments of emotional breakdown, crying over failed attempts at breastfeeding or feelings of inadequacy about my ability to comfort my own child, their response was typically to offer practical solutions that ignored the emotional component of my distress. Maybe you should pump bottles so other people can help with feeding, my mother would suggest when she found me crying after a difficult nursing session. You're putting too much pressure on yourself to do everything personally. All babies go through fussy phases, Jessica would add. You just need to remember that this is temporary and focus on the positive aspects of having a healthy child. Quote, their advice was logical and well-intentioned, but it consistently missed the emotional reality of my experience. I wasn't crying because breastfeeding was mechanically difficult, or because Emma's fussy periods were inconvenient. I was crying because I felt fundamentally inadequate as a mother, and overwhelmed by responsibilities that other women seemed to manage naturally. The cumulative effect of these daily interactions was a growing sense of isolation, despite being surrounded by family members who wanted to help. Their help came with constant feedback about my performance and suggestions for improvement that implied I wasn't meeting basic standards of maternal competence. By the end of each day, I felt more confused and doubtful about my instincts and capabilities than I had felt at the beginning. The conversations with David that had provided reassurance and validation seemed increasingly distant and less relevant than the immediate feedback I was receiving from people who could observe my daily struggles firsthand. What I didn't understand then was that my family's well-intentioned advice was not only unhelpful, but potentially harmful to someone experiencing the symptoms of postpartum depression. Their emphasis on pushing through difficult emotions, suppressing natural responses to infant distress, and maintaining gratitude and perspective regardless of personal struggles, contradicted every evidence-based principle of postpartum mental health support. In 3 days, David would arrive and witness these dynamics firsthand. His professional expertise would provide a completely different framework for understanding my experiences and my family's responses. But for now, I was trapped in a daily cycle of trying and failing to meet expectations that were based on fundamental misunderstandings about postpartum mental health and maternal adjustment. The emergency pediatrician's office at 2:47 a.m. on Sunday morning was not where I had expected to spend my final night before David's return, but Emma's sudden spike in temperature and inconsolable crying had triggered every maternal fear I possessed. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the waiting room where my mother sat rigid with disapproval, her silk robe hastily covered by my father's winter coat, while Emma writhed restlessly in my arms, despite the infant acetaminophen we had administered an hour earlier. "This is exactly what I was talking about," my mother whispered tersely, her voice carrying the sharp edge of vindicated frustration. "You panic at every minor symptom and create unnecessary drama for everyone involved. Dr. Walsh examined Emma just 3 days ago and confirmed she was perfectly healthy." The young resident physician who eventually examined Emma was thorough but puzzled, finding no obvious source of infection or distress that would explain her fever and agitation. Her temperature had peaked at 101.2 degrees Fahrenheit, high enough to warrant medical evaluation for an infant under 3 months old, but all other clinical indicators appeared normal. "Sometimes babies develop brief fevers without identifiable causes," Dr. Stevens explained while completing his documentation. "Her examination is completely normal, and her temperature is already decreasing. However, I want you to monitor her closely and return immediately if her symptoms worsen or if you notice any changes in her alertness or feeding patterns." My mother's expression throughout this explanation conveyed her belief that the entire emergency room visit had been an overreaction based on my excessive anxiety and poor judgment. Her body language suggested that a more experienced, competent mother would have managed Emma's symptoms at home without disrupting everyone's sleep or incurring unnecessary medical expenses. "How often do you see this kind of reaction from first-time mothers?" my mother asked Dr. Stevens, her tone implying that my decision to seek emergency care represented typical new parent hysteria rather than appropriate medical caution. "Actually, Mrs. Morrison, your daughter made exactly the right decision," Dr. Stevens replied with professional authority that surprised both my mother and me. "Fever in infants under 3 months old always requires immediate medical evaluation because their immune systems are still developing, and serious infections can progress rapidly without obvious symptoms." His validation of my instincts felt like a lifeline in an ocean of constant second-guessing and family criticism. For the first time in days, a medical professional had confirmed that my maternal concerns were appropriate rather than excessive. However, my mother's response to this information revealed her fundamental inability to acknowledge when her assumptions might be incorrect. "Well, of course we wanted to be safe," she replied smoothly, reframing the situation to suggest that the emergency room visit had been a collaborative family decision rather than my individual choice despite their obvious reluctance. "We just wondered whether there might have been alternatives to consider first." During the drive home through empty suburban streets, my mother's post-crisis analysis focused on the stress and inconvenience that my overreaction had created for the entire family. "Your father has an important client meeting tomorrow morning, and now he'll be exhausted because of this unnecessary emergency room visit," she said while adjusting the rearview mirror to observe Emma sleeping peacefully in her car seat. Jessica will be working a double shift at the hospital after being awakened at 2 a.m. to help with a situation that probably could have been managed with a cool bath and infant Tylenol, she continued, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated frustration. You need to develop better judgment about when situations truly require professional intervention versus when they can be handled at home. The implication was clear. My maternal instincts were not only unreliable but actively harmful to family harmony and individual well-being. Despite the emergency room physician's explicit validation of my decision, my mother had reconstructed the narrative to reinforce her assessment of my incompetence and poor judgment. Sunday morning arrived with the exhaustion that follows interrupted sleep and family conflict, but also with the anticipation of David's arrival that afternoon. Emma's fever had completely resolved, and she seemed to have returned to her normal patterns of eating and sleeping. However, the previous night's events had crystallized the fundamental disconnect between my family's expectations and my experiences as a new mother. My father's assessment of the emergency room visit focused on the financial implications and the disruption to family routines. Emergency room visits can cost thousands of dollars, especially when they involve extensive testing for problems that resolve on their own, he announced during breakfast while reviewing his phone messages. Insurance may not cover non-essential emergency care, and will probably receive bills for several months. Next time, you might consider calling Dr. Walsh first, Jessica added while preparing for her hospital shift. She has an after-hours service, and she could have provided guidance about whether emergency care was really necessary. Most experienced mothers learn to distinguish between genuine emergencies and normal infant symptoms that feel alarming but aren't actually dangerous. Their collective response to the previous night's crisis revealed the impossible double bind I faced as a new mother in their household. If I sought medical care for concerning symptoms, I was overreacting and creating unnecessary stress and expense. If I failed to seek care and something serious developed, I would be negligent and irresponsible. The only acceptable approach was to possess perfect judgment that I clearly lacked, and that no one seemed willing to help me develop. The morning hours passed slowly as I alternated between caring for Emma and preparing for David's arrival. My journal entries from the previous week documented a clear pattern of systematic undermining that I was only beginning to understand as potentially harmful rather than merely frustrating. The accumulated evidence painted a picture of family dynamics that prioritized their comfort and assumptions over my mental health and legitimate needs for support. Emma's behavior provided stark contrast to the family narratives about infant predictability and maternal competence. During periods when I felt relatively calm and confident, she often experienced fussy episodes that resisted all soothing efforts. When I was most anxious and overwhelmed, she sometimes settled easily and slept peacefully for extended periods. The lack of correlation between my emotional state and her behavior contradicted my family's theories about infant responsiveness to maternal anxiety. At 11:30 a.m., my mother announced her intention to prepare a special lunch to welcome David and demonstrate our family's hospitality and appreciation for his professional success. Her menu planning involved elaborate preparations that would showcase her domestic skills while providing opportunities for extended conversation about David's career and our future plans. I want David to see how well we've been taking care of you and Emma, she explained, while organizing ingredients for her signature salmon dish and homemade bread. He's probably been worried about leaving you here while he was at his conference, and I want him to know that we've provided excellent support and guidance. Quote, Jessica contributed to the preparation by cleaning the house to magazine-worthy standards and arranging fresh flowers that would create the perfect backdrop for family photographs. David seemed so serious at your wedding, she observed, while adjusting the dining room centerpiece. Maybe he's more relaxed now that he's had time to adjust to fatherhood and see how well you're managing with family support. Their preparation activities revealed their expectation that David's visit would provide validation for their approach to supporting my transition to motherhood. They anticipated gratitude for their guidance and appreciation for their willingness to accommodate my perceived need for extended family assistance during the postpartum period. What they didn't understand was that David possessed professional expertise that would enable him to assess both my mental health status and the quality of support I had been receiving. His trained eye would recognize symptoms and dynamics that were invisible to family members, who lacked specialized knowledge about perinatal mental health conditions. At 1:15 p.m., the sound of David's car in the driveway triggered a complex mixture of relief, anticipation, and anxiety that had been building throughout the week. Through the front window, I watched him gather his luggage and conference materials with the methodical precision that characterized his approach to both professional and personal responsibilities. Emma was sleeping peacefully in her carrier, temporarily content after a successful feeding, while my family assembled in the living room with expressions of welcoming anticipation. They had arranged themselves to create the impression of harmonious family support, with comfortable seating and refreshments that would facilitate pleasant conversation about David's conference and our experiences during his absence. David's entrance was marked by his immediate focus on Emma and me, his professional assessment beginning before he had completed his greetings to my family. His trained observation skills enabled him to notice details that were invisible to people without specialized knowledge. My physical posture that suggested chronic exhaustion, my emotional state that reflected more than normal new mother fatigue, my interaction patterns with Emma that indicated attachment concerns rather than bonding difficulties. "How has everything been?" he asked while gently lifting Emma from her carrier, his question directed primarily to me, despite my family's readiness to provide comprehensive reports about the week's events and my adjustment progress. "It's been challenging," I replied carefully, aware that my family was monitoring my response for evidence of appropriate gratitude and positive attitude. "Emma's been fussier than usual, and I've been struggling with sleep and anxiety." "She's been doing much better than she realizes," my mother interjected, with the confidence of someone providing objective assessment rather than biased opinion. "We've helped her establish better routines, and Emma is a perfectly normal, healthy baby. Sarah just needs to develop more confidence in her maternal instincts." David's expression remained neutral, but I noticed the subtle shift in his posture that indicated professional attention to information that contradicted his clinical expectations. His assessment of my family's report would be informed by his understanding of how families often minimize or misinterpret postpartum mental health symptoms. "Has Sarah been able to get adequate rest and support for her own needs?" David asked, his question framed in language that assumed my well-being was a legitimate priority rather than secondary to infant care and family harmony. "We've been taking excellent care of both Sarah and Emma," my father replied with the satisfaction of someone reporting successful project completion. "Sarah has had complete family support, home-cooked meals, help with household tasks, and access to medical consultation. Dr. Walsh, our longtime family pediatrician, examined Emma earlier this week and confirmed that she's developing perfectly normally." David's follow-up questions revealed his systematic approach to gathering information about my week's experiences. Unlike my family's focus on Emma's physical development and my apparent adjustment progress, David's inquiries addressed specific indicators of maternal mental health and the quality of postpartum support systems. "Sarah, have you been experiencing any changes in appetite, sleep patterns, or energy levels beyond what would be expected from normal infant care demands?" he asked, his clinical language providing a framework for discussing symptoms that my family had consistently dismissed as normal adjustment challenges. "I've been having trouble sleeping, even when Emma is resting peacefully," I admitted, grateful for the opportunity to describe my experiences to someone with professional knowledge about their significance. "And I've been crying more than seems normal, sometimes over things that shouldn't be upsetting." "Those are important symptoms that warrant professional assessment," David replied, his validation providing immediate relief from the week's accumulated doubt and self-criticism. "Changes in sleep patterns and emotional regulation are significant indicators that shouldn't be dismissed as normal adjustment difficulties." My mother's response to this exchange revealed her discomfort with David's professional framework for understanding my experiences. "All new mothers have sleep disruption and emotional volatility," she said with the authority of personal experience. "The key is not to dwell on temporary challenges but to focus on developing practical skills and positive perspectives." Actually, Mrs. Morrison, persistent sleep disruption and mood changes can indicate postpartum depression or anxiety disorders that require professional treatment, David replied with gentle but firm correction. "These conditions affect approximately 20% of new mothers and have nothing to do with character strength or maternal competence." The room fell silent as my family processed this information, which contradicted every assumption that had guided their approach to supporting my postpartum adjustment. David's professional authority created a moment of cognitive dissonance that would reshape everything they thought they understood about my week's experiences. However, the most significant moment came when David asked to speak with me privately before lunch, suggesting that he needed to conduct a proper clinical assessment of my mental health status. This request implied that my family's confident conclusions about my adjustment progress might be premature or inaccurate. "Is there some concern about Sarah's condition?" Jessica asked, her medical training enabling her to recognize the implications of David's request for private consultation. "I want to ensure that Sarah receives appropriate screening and support for her postpartum recovery," David replied diplomatically. Standard clinical practice includes systematic assessment of maternal mental health, regardless of apparent adjustment progress. Quote, "As we moved toward the guest bedroom for privacy, I felt the weight of the week's accumulated experiences and the anticipation of finally having my struggles understood by someone with the expertise to provide accurate assessment and appropriate support. The confrontation that would reshape my family's understanding of postpartum mental health was about to begin." The guest bedroom door closed with a soft click that seemed to separate two completely different worlds. The one where my struggles were character flaws requiring correction, and the one where David's clinical expertise would finally provide accurate assessment of my condition. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains my mother had hung with such care, creating patterns on the hardwood floor where David's medical bag sat beside his laptop, both tools of his profession that my family had never seen him use. "Sarah, I need you to know that what I'm about to do is conduct a formal clinical assessment," David said, his voice carrying the gentle authority I remembered from our early research conversations. "I've been observing you since I arrived, and I'm concerned that you may be experiencing postpartum depression that requires immediate professional intervention." He opened his laptop and accessed what I recognized as the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, a standardized screening tool that he had mentioned during our research work, but that I had never expected to complete myself. "This assessment will help us understand the severity of your symptoms and determine appropriate treatment options." The questions were specific and comprehensive, addressing sleep patterns, appetite changes, anxiety levels, and feelings about myself and my ability to cope with daily responsibilities. Unlike my family's casual inquiries about my adjustment progress, David's screening process acknowledged the complexity of postpartum mental health and the importance of systematic evaluation. "Over the past 7 days, have you been able to laugh and see the funny side of things?" David read from the assessment, his tone professional but supportive. "Not really," I admitted, realizing as I spoke that I couldn't remember the last time I had felt genuine joy or amusement. "Everything feels heavy and overwhelming, even things that used to make me happy." "Have you blamed yourself unnecessarily when things went wrong?" "Yes, constantly. Every time Emma cries or seems unhappy, I assume it's because I'm doing something wrong or because I'm not a good enough mother." As we progressed through the screening questions, a clear picture emerged of symptoms that indicated moderate to severe postpartum depression rather than normal adjustment challenges. My responses revealed persistent sadness, anxiety, guilt, and feelings of inadequacy that extended far beyond typical new mother concerns. "Sarah, your score indicates clinically significant postpartum depression that requires professional treatment," David said after completing the assessment. "This is not a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It's a medical condition that affects your brain chemistry and emotional regulation, and it's completely treatable with appropriate intervention." The relief of finally having my experiences understood and validated by someone with clinical expertise was overwhelming. For the first time in weeks, I felt like my struggles were real and legitimate, rather than evidence of personal inadequacy or insufficient gratitude. "But my family keeps saying this is normal," I said, voicing the confusion that had plagued me throughout the week. "They insist that all new mothers go through difficult adjustments and that I just need to try harder and be more positive." "Your family means well, but their understanding of postpartum mental health is not based on current medical knowledge," David replied with careful diplomacy. Postpartum depression is a serious condition that affects approximately 1 in 5 new mothers. It's not caused by lack of effort or a positive attitude, and it can't be resolved through willpower or family support alone. David's explanation provided a framework for understanding why my family's well-intentioned advice had not only failed to help, but had actually worsened my symptoms. Their emphasis on individual responsibility and attitude adjustment contradicted evidence-based approaches to postpartum mental health treatment. What I'm most concerned about, David continued, is that the environment here has been actively harmful to your recovery. The constant suggestions that your symptoms are normal and that you should be able to manage them independently can worsen depression and delay appropriate treatment. His professional assessment of my family's impact on my condition provided validation for suspicions I had been reluctant to acknowledge. The people who claimed to be helping me had actually been undermining my mental health through systematic dismissal of my legitimate symptoms and needs. David, there's something else you need to know, I said, gathering courage to describe the week's most troubling interactions. They brought Dr. Walsh here to assess my situation, and she concluded that I was dealing with new mother nerves that would resolve with better routines and increased confidence. David's expression shifted to one of professional concern mixed with controlled anger. Dr. Walsh is a retired pediatrician, not a mental health specialist. She has no training or expertise in postpartum psychiatric conditions. Her assessment was not only inappropriate but potentially dangerous. But she seemed so confident about her diagnosis, I protested, still struggling to reconcile David's professional perspective with the authority my family had attributed to Dr. Walsh's opinion. Sarah, conducting mental health assessments requires specialized training and proper screening tools. What you're describing is a pediatrician making psychiatric diagnoses without appropriate qualifications or methodology. It's equivalent to me attempting to perform cardiac surgery because I'm a medical doctor. His analogy provided clear context for understanding why Dr. Walsh's confident assessment had been fundamentally flawed despite her decades of medical experience. Professional expertise in one area did not automatically translate to competence in specialized fields requiring different training and knowledge. A soft knock on the bedroom door interrupted our conversation, followed by my mother's voice announcing that lunch was ready and that the family was eager to hear about David's conference and our plans for returning to Chicago. The timing felt ominous, as if my family sensed that something significant was occurring beyond their observation and control. David, before we go out there, I said urgently, you should know that they've been expecting you to be grateful for their support and to validate their approach to helping me. They're planning to ask you about your conference and your assessment of how well they've taken care of Emma and me. David's response revealed his understanding of the delicate family dynamics we were about to navigate. Sarah, I need you to know that I'm going to provide accurate information about your condition and the appropriate treatment you need. This may create conflict with your family's assumptions, but your mental health is the priority. What if they don't believe you? I asked, voicing my fear that even David's professional expertise might not overcome my family's entrenched beliefs about my situation. Then I'll need to help them understand the difference between their well-intentioned but uninformed opinions and evidence-based medical knowledge, David replied with quiet determination. Your recovery depends on getting appropriate treatment and support, not on maintaining family harmony at the expense of your mental health. As we prepared to rejoin my family for lunch, David gathered his assessment materials and laptop, symbols of his professional authority that would soon challenge everything my family believed about postpartum mental health and maternal competence. The confrontation that would reshape our family dynamics was about to begin. The dining room had been transformed into a showcase of domestic perfection, with my mother's finest china, fresh flowers, and the elaborate meal she had prepared to demonstrate her hospitality and family management skills. My father sat at the head of the table reviewing his phone, while Jessica arranged serving dishes with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. David, we're so glad you're back safely, my mother announced as we entered the room, her tone suggesting that she was prepared to receive praise for her caretaking efforts during his absence. We've taken excellent care of Sarah and Emma, and I think you'll find that Sarah has made significant progress with our support and guidance. David's response was measured and professional, acknowledging their efforts while preparing to provide information that would contradict their assessment of my progress. I appreciate your intentions to help Sarah during this challenging time. However, I need to share some important information about her current condition that will require immediate changes to her care and support." The room fell silent as my family processed David's serious tone and formal language, which suggested that something more significant than routine postpartum adjustment was being addressed. Jessica's medical training enabled her to recognize that David was speaking in clinical rather than social terms. "Is there a problem with Sarah's health?" my father asked, his business-oriented mindset immediately focusing on practical implications and necessary actions. "Sarah is experiencing moderate to severe postpartum depression, which is a serious medical condition requiring professional treatment," David replied with clinical directness. "I've conducted a formal assessment using standardized screening tools, and her symptoms indicate the need for immediate psychiatric intervention." My mother's response revealed her fundamental inability to process information that contradicted her established beliefs about my situation. But Dr. Walsh examined her just 3 days ago and concluded that she was dealing with normal new mother adjustment challenges. Surely a pediatrician with 35 years of experience would recognize if there were serious mental health concerns. "Mrs. Morrison, Dr. Walsh is not qualified to diagnose or treat postpartum psychiatric conditions," David replied with patient but firm correction. "Postpartum depression requires assessment by mental health specialists using evidence-based screening tools and diagnostic criteria." Her conclusion was not based on appropriate clinical methodology. Jessica's professional pride was clearly threatened by David's implicit criticism of medical assessment practices within their social circle. Dr. Walsh has been practicing medicine for decades and has seen thousands of new mothers. I think she would recognize the difference between normal adjustment difficulties and serious mental health problems." Jessica, postpartum depression is a specialized field that requires specific training and expertise, David explained, his tone remaining respectful, despite the obvious challenge to his professional competence. "Many physicians, including experienced pediatricians, lack adequate knowledge about perinatal mental health conditions. This isn't a criticism of Dr. Walsh's general medical skills, but recognition that mental health assessment requires specialized qualifications." The conversation continued with my family presenting various arguments designed to minimize my symptoms and defend their approach to supporting my postpartum adjustment. They cited other successful mothers in their social circle, referenced traditional approaches to new parent challenges, and questioned whether modern psychiatric terminology might be creating problems where none existed. However, David's systematic responses provided evidence-based information that gradually dismantled their assumptions while maintaining respect for their genuine concern about my well-being. His professional authority became increasingly apparent as he addressed their questions with detailed knowledge about postpartum mental health research, treatment protocols, and recovery outcomes. "The approaches you've been recommending, emphasizing individual willpower, minimizing symptoms, discouraging professional assessment, are not only ineffective for treating postpartum depression, but can actually worsen the condition," David explained with clinical precision. "Sarah needs evidence-based treatment, including therapy and possibly medication, not continued family pressure to resolve her symptoms through attitude adjustment." My father's response focused on practical concerns about treatment costs, time requirements, and potential impact on family relationships. "Are you saying that Sarah needs long-term psychiatric treatment? What kind of timeline and expense are we looking at?" "Postpartum depression is highly treatable with appropriate intervention," David replied reassuringly. "Most women experience significant improvement within weeks of beginning proper treatment. The cost of professional care is minimal compared to the long-term consequences of untreated postpartum depression on both maternal and infant well-being." The most significant moment came when my mother asked directly about David's qualifications to make such serious diagnoses and treatment recommendations. Her question was posed with the politeness that barely concealed skepticism about his expertise relative to their family's accumulated wisdom about child rearing and maternal adjustment. "David, we appreciate your concern for Sarah, but we're wondering about your background in mental health assessment," she said with careful diplomacy. "We want to ensure that any treatment decisions are based on appropriate medical expertise, rather than general impressions about Sarah's adjustment progress." David's response would finally reveal the full extent of his professional credentials and the irony of their week-long dismissal of my concerns, despite having access to one of the region's leading experts in postpartum mental health. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Drive." David Chen, a board-certified psychiatrist specializing in perinatal and postpartum mental health at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He replied with quiet authority. I've been treating postpartum depression and anxiety disorders for 8 years, and my research on maternal mental health has been published in major psychiatric journals. I'm considered one of the leading experts in this field in the Chicago metropolitan area. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. My family's faces reflected the shock of realizing that they had been dismissing the concerns of someone whose wife was married to one of the region's most qualified experts in exactly the condition they had been denying existed. The elaborate lunch my mother had prepared remained largely untouched as the implications of David's revelation reshaped everything they thought they understood about the previous week's events and their approach to supporting my postpartum recovery. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked the passing of 37 minutes of silence since David's revelation, its steady ticking the only sound breaking the profound quiet that had settled over the dining room like a heavy blanket. My mother's carefully prepared salmon had grown cold on bone china plates, the fresh flowers she had arranged that morning now seeming to mock the elaborate hospitality she had planned to showcase her family's competence and wisdom. Jessica was the first to break the silence, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone attempting to salvage professional credibility from a situation that had exposed fundamental gaps in her medical knowledge. David, I had no idea about your specialization. When we met at the wedding, you seemed so quiet that we assumed you were perhaps early in your career or working in general practice. I understand the confusion, David replied with diplomatic grace that revealed nothing of what he must have been thinking about their week-long dismissal of his wife's legitimate medical concerns. I tend to listen more than I speak in social situations, and I don't typically discuss my work unless specifically asked about it. My father's business-oriented mind was already calculating the implications of the revelation, processing the gap between their confident assessments and the reality of David's expertise. So when Sarah mentioned that you thought she might be experiencing postpartum depression, you were speaking from specialized professional knowledge rather than general concern. Yes, Mr. Morrison. I've been treating women with postpartum mood disorders for 8 years, and I recognized Sarah's symptoms immediately. My recommendation for professional assessment wasn't casual advice. It was clinical necessity based on established diagnostic criteria. The weight of David's words settled over my family like an avalanche of realization about the significance of their dismissive responses to my struggles throughout the week. Every conversation where they had minimized my concerns, every suggestion that I needed to try harder or be more grateful, every comparison to other mothers who managed better, all of it had occurred in the presence of someone whose professional expertise directly contradicted their assumptions. My mother's response revealed her struggle to reconcile her absolute confidence in her own parenting wisdom with the uncomfortable reality that she had been providing harmful advice to someone experiencing a serious medical condition. But Sarah seemed to be improving with our support and structure. She was eating better and sleeping more consistently. Mrs. Morrison, temporary improvements in basic functioning don't indicate recovery from postpartum depression, David explained with patient professionalism. Depression symptoms often fluctuate, and external structure can mask underlying psychological distress without addressing the root causes of the condition. Are you saying that everything we did to help Sarah was wrong? Jessica asked, her question carrying defensive undertones that suggested she was beginning to understand the magnitude of their misunderstanding. Your intentions were excellent, but some of the approaches inadvertently worsened Sarah's symptoms, David replied with careful diplomacy. Minimizing her concerns, emphasizing individual willpower over medical treatment, and comparing her struggles to other mothers' apparent success are contraindicated for postpartum depression recovery. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of my family's investment in their own competence and wisdom regarding maternal mental health. They had built their entire approach to supporting me on assumptions that David's expertise now revealed as not only incorrect, but potentially harmful. The cognitive dissonance was enormous, requiring them to acknowledge that their confident advice had been undermining rather than supporting my recovery. Dr. Walsh seemed so certain about her assessment, my mother said, clinging to the professional validation that had reinforced their approach earlier in the week. She has decades of experience with new mothers and babies. Dr. Walsh's experience is in pediatric medicine, not maternal mental health, David replied with professional courtesy that didn't mask his concern about inappropriate diagnostic practices. Postpartum depression screening requires specialized training and validated assessment tools. Her conclusion was based on observation rather than evidence-based evaluation methodology. Jessica's medical training enabled her to understand the implications of David's critique, though accepting it required acknowledging significant gaps in her own knowledge about mental health conditions. Are you saying that pediatricians shouldn't assess maternal psychological adjustment during infant checkups? Pediatricians should absolutely screen for postpartum depression, but using proper tools and training rather than clinical impressions, David explained. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends standardized screening protocols, but many practitioners lack adequate preparation for identifying and addressing maternal mental health concerns. My father's practical mindset focused on moving forward rather than analyzing past mistakes. What does Sarah need now, and how can we support her recovery appropriately? Sarah needs immediate psychiatric care, including therapy and likely medication, David replied, his clinical directness providing clear guidance for necessary next steps. She also needs family support that acknowledges her condition as medical rather than characterological, and understanding that recovery takes time and professional intervention. The shift in family dynamics was immediate and profound. Where they had previously offered constant advice and suggestions based on their assumed expertise, they now deferred to David's professional knowledge, while expressing uncertainty about their role in my recovery process. The authority structure that had defined our interactions throughout the week was completely reversed. How should we have responded to Sarah's concerns? My mother asked, her question revealing genuine desire to understand appropriate support strategies, rather than defend their previous approaches. Listen without judgment, validate her experiences, encourage professional assessment, and provide emotional support without trying to solve her symptoms through advice or attitude adjustment, David explained. Family support is crucial for postpartum depression recovery, but it needs to complement rather than replace professional treatment. The most significant moment came when my family began to acknowledge the specific ways their well-intentioned support had actually hindered my recovery. This recognition required them to examine their assumptions about mental health, maternal competence, and the relationship between character strength and medical conditions. I think we made Sarah feel worse about herself when we compared her to other mothers, Jessica admitted with visible discomfort about acknowledging her professional blind spots. We thought we were providing perspective and encouragement, but we were actually reinforcing her feelings of inadequacy. And when we suggested that she just needed more confidence and structure, we were essentially telling her that her medical condition was a personal choice, rather than a brain chemistry problem, my father added, his analytical mind processing the logical implications of David's explanations. My mother's acknowledgement was the most difficult and significant, requiring her to confront the gap between her maternal instincts and evidence-based understanding of postpartum mental health. I was so focused on helping Sarah become a competent mother that I didn't recognize she was struggling with a serious medical condition that required professional treatment. David's response to their emerging understanding was generous and educational rather than punitive, recognizing that their mistakes had been based on love and concern rather than malicious intent. Postpartum depression is widely misunderstood, even within medical communities. Your responses reflected common cultural misconceptions rather than personal failures. The conversation gradually shifted from defensive explanations to collaborative planning for my recovery and return to Chicago. My family's questions focused on learning appropriate support strategies, rather than justifying their previous approaches. They wanted to understand how they could help without interfering with professional treatment protocols. Will Sarah need long-term psychiatric care, or is this something that resolves quickly with proper treatment? My father asked, his concern now focused on my well-being, rather than family convenience or expense. With appropriate treatment, most women with postpartum depression experience significant improvement within 6 to 8 weeks, David explained reassuringly. However, recovery requires consistent professional support and family understanding that this is a medical condition requiring time and treatment. The practical arrangements for my return to Chicago proceeded with remarkable efficiency once my family accepted the reality of my condition and the necessity for professional intervention. They offered to help with childcare, transportation, and household management in ways that would support, rather than complicate, my treatment process. We want to learn how to be helpful rather than harmful, my mother said, her words carrying the weight of genuine remorse about the week's misunderstandings. Can you recommend resources for families supporting women with postpartum depression? David's recommendations included educational materials, support groups for family members, and communication strategies that would enable them to provide appropriate emotional support while respecting professional treatment boundaries. His guidance transformed their approach from confident advice-giving to humble learning about evidence-based support methods. The drive back to Chicago that evening provided opportunities for David and me to process the week's events and their implications for both my recovery and our family relationships. Emma slept peacefully in her car seat, blissfully unaware of the dramatic revelations that had reshaped everyone's understanding of the postpartum period. "I'm sorry you had to endure a week of that treatment," David said as we navigated the highway traffic leaving Naperville. "If I had understood how they were responding to your symptoms, I would have cut the conference short and intervened immediately." "I didn't want to worry you or interfere with your professional obligations," I replied, recognizing how my family's constant suggestions that I was overreacting had influenced my decision to minimize my struggles when talking with David. "Sarah, your mental health is always the priority," he responded with firm gentleness. "Conferences and professional obligations are important, but they're never more important than your well-being and recovery." The weeks that followed brought systematic treatment for my postpartum depression, through a combination of therapy and medication that David coordinated with other specialists at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The improvement in my symptoms was gradual but undeniable, validating his clinical assessment and treatment recommendations. More significantly, my family's approach to supporting my recovery transformed completely. They educated themselves about postpartum mental health through resources David provided, attended family therapy sessions to understand appropriate support strategies, and consistently validated my experiences rather than offering unsolicited advice. My mother's evolution was particularly remarkable. She joined a support group for family members of women with postpartum depression, where she learned about the prevalence and seriousness of maternal mental health conditions. Her natural tendency to provide guidance and solutions was redirected toward advocacy and emotional support, rather than problem-solving attempts. "I had no idea how common and serious postpartum depression really is," she told me during one of our phone conversations several weeks later. "The support group has taught me that my role is to listen and encourage rather than try to fix or minimize your experiences." Jessica's professional development included specialized training in postpartum mental health screening and support, recognizing that her position in pediatric nursing provided opportunities to identify and assist women experiencing maternal mood disorders. She became an advocate for evidence-based mental health assessment within her hospital system. "Working with David helped me realize how much I didn't know about maternal mental health," she acknowledged during a family dinner after my recovery was well established. "I've taken additional training so I can better support the families we see in our pediatric unit." My father's practical approach to problem solving was channeled into research about postpartum depression resources and advocacy for better mental health coverage through his business insurance plans. He used his business connections to promote awareness about maternal mental health within his professional community. The most profound change was in our family's understanding of mental health conditions and their relationship to character, competence, and personal strength. They learned that postpartum depression was not a reflection of maternal inadequacy, but a medical condition requiring professional treatment and family support. 6 months later, as I held Emma during a family gathering to celebrate her first Christmas, my mother's conversation with a neighbor whose daughter was struggling postpartum provided clear evidence of how completely their perspective had transformed. "Mental health challenges are just as real and serious as physical conditions," she explained to someone expressing confusion about postpartum depression. "The most important thing families can do is encourage professional assessment and provide emotional support, rather than trying to solve the problem through advice or positive thinking." The irony of the situation was not lost on any of us. My family had spent a week dismissing the concerns of someone whose husband was one of the region's leading experts in exactly the condition they insisted didn't exist. Their confident advice had contradicted evidence-based treatment approaches, and their well-intentioned support had actually hindered recovery from a serious medical condition. However, the experience ultimately strengthened our family relationships by teaching us about the importance of humility, professional expertise, and evidence-based understanding of mental health conditions. My recovery provided testimony to the effectiveness of appropriate treatment, while my family's education about postpartum depression enabled them to become advocates rather than obstacles for maternal mental health. The experience taught all of us that love and good intentions are not sufficient when dealing with serious medical conditions, that professional expertise matters more than personal experience, and that acknowledging our limitations is essential for providing appropriate support to people we care about. Emma thrived as my mental health improved, our attachment deepened, and our family learned to provide support that enhanced rather than undermined professional treatment. The week that began with systematic dismissal of my legitimate medical concerns had transformed into a powerful education about maternal mental health that would influence our family's approach to supporting others facing similar challenges. Most importantly, I learned to trust my own experiences and advocate for appropriate care, rather than accepting well-intentioned but harmful advice from people who lacked relevant expertise. The validation of my symptoms and the effectiveness of proper treatment provided confidence that would serve me well in future challenges and advocacy opportunities. The story that began with family members calling my postpartum depression attention-seeking ended with them becoming educated advocates for maternal mental health, demonstrating that even well-established misconceptions can be transformed through professional education and genuine commitment to supporting recovery rather than defending assumptions. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.